Today is the fourth Sunday of Lent, and to celebrate the season, we have a message series that we're calling Attitude Adjustment. And we're looking at a particular attitude adjustment that every single one of us needs to make, no matter who you are. In fact, the less you think you need this adjustment, the more you probably do. And as soon as you think you've mastered it or that you have it, you've lost it. This attitude is actually a virtue. A virtue can be a habit of high standard, and this virtue is, in a certain sense, the highest standard and the most important virtue of all. Over these Lenten weekends, we're looking at its application when it comes to living out the Christian life more successfully. What we're talking about can be called the most important virtue in certain ways because it is a prerequisite for every other virtue. We're talking, of course, about humility. Now, humility is critically important, but it is often misunderstood. There are some people who think that humility is weakness or low self-esteem, a lack of ambition, a conscious effort to minimize or to downplay your accomplishments. But that is not humility. That is not virtue. It's not a sign of spiritual maturity. It's actually a mark of insecurity. And when we find ourselves thinking that way, then we need to work on it and overcome it. Humility is not a low opinion of yourself, but rather a clear opinion of yourself. Humility is a knowledge of who you are as you really are. But we've said that humility is actually surprisingly powerful too, because if you can be humble, then you can learn and grow. If you can be humble, you can bring peace to your relationships. If you can be humble, you can develop patience with the world around you. A few weeks ago, we learned that humility is grounded in the reality that every single thing that we have comes from God. All of our talents and our abilities, all of our opportunities come from Him. We also looked at the key way to grow in humility, and we learned to listen. It turns out, humble people are listeners. We listen first and foremost to God Himself because He knows more than we do about us and about everything else too. And last week we looked at the comparison trap that kills our humility. We're tempted over and over and over again to compare ourselves to other people, especially when it comes to their faults and to their failures. And we do that so that we can feel better about ourselves. Now that's understandable, but it's not helpful. It only distracts us and gets us off course, and it can actually inflame our pride. There's only one good comparison to make, and that's the comparison we can make with ourselves. Who are we in relation to who God wants us to be? Incidentally, if you missed any of these messages or you'd like to share them with someone that you know, they're all available on our website. You can simply go to stalphonsus.net and click on Messages. Today we're going to discuss how to be humble in the face of our own faults and failures. And to do it, we're looking at a surprising little story Jesus tells us just before the end of His earthly life. This parable is found in the 15th chapter of St. Luke's Gospel. Now at this point, the tax collectors and sinners were drawing near to listen to Jesus, but the Pharisees and the scribes begin complaining. They're saying, "This man welcomes sinners and he eats with them." So people who would never go to church, people who had nothing to do with religion or God, those people were attracted to Jesus. People who were nothing like Him liked Him. And that bothered the church people. They thought that that was their territory. They thought that they remained holy by separating themselves from such people. But Jesus came to dispel these notions, of course, and the church people, they just didn't get it. And so they grumbled and they complained against Jesus. They did it all the time throughout the Gospels. But here's what happened this time. In response to their complaint, Jesus tells a story, and it goes like this. There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger of them said to the father, "Father, give me the share of the property that will come to me." Now, if you grew up in church, you've heard this story before. It's usually called the parable of the prodigal son. And it might be so familiar with you that you actually overlook its premise. And its premise is outrageous. Think about it, ready? When does someone normally gain an inheritance? When someone dies, right? But this son is essentially telling his father, "I can't live with you anymore. You are dead to me. Give me my share of the money." Nice, huh? No bueno. It is shocking. It is shocking on its own, but even more shocking is what the father does in response. The father actually divided the property between the 2 of them. He accepts his son's proposal, and he splits the property between the older son and the younger one. And we learn that after a few days, that younger son collected all of his belongings and set off to a different country, where he squandered his inheritance in a life of indulgence. So he leaves his father and the farm behind, and he's off to Vegas to party like a rock star, which predictably ends badly. We read, "When he had spent everything, a severe famine took place throughout that country, and he began to be in need." So he runs out of cash, and then the recession hits. His foolishness is matched by misfortune, making a bad situation even worse. Now, it seems like life delivers that kind of thing up all the time, doesn't it? You make a poor decision, and then another decision beyond your control aggravates the situation. You find yourself deep in debt, and it's your own fault, but then you get slammed by an unexpected expense that was not your fault. You wait until the very last minute to study for an exam. And then at the very last minute, you get another assignment handed to you. That's just the way it seems to work sometimes. Anyway, in what was apparently his only option, this unfortunate young man does something truly unthinkable in that culture. He hired himself out to one of the local citizens as a tender of the pigs. And we hear that he is so hungry that he would love to get a bite of the pig's slop. But he wasn't even allowed to have that. No occupation could have been more disgraceful for a Jewish man of a respectable family. Pious Jews had nothing to do with swine because they were considered to be unclean. But the son is so desperate that he is willing to do it anyway. He's gone about as low as he could go. And it's just at that point that the story begins to turn. And it turns on a single phrase. When he came to his senses. When he came to his senses. In Hebrew, that phrase means taking responsibility for your actions. Suddenly, it dawns on him that not only does he have a problem, but he's the author of his problem. When we have a problem, it can take quite a lot for us to even acknowledge it. We know that. But even after we do, it can be more difficult for us to take responsibility for it. Everything in us, every single thing in us wants to blame somebody else, to find an excuse, or to take the easy way out. My marriage is in trouble because my wife doesn't understand what I need. My grades aren't any good because my teachers are out to get me. My career is going nowhere because my boss is an idiot. Wah. Well, that's certainly one way to approach our problems. But another route is offered to us through humility. We can be humble and we can take responsibility for why we are where we are. My marriage is in trouble because I haven't made it a priority. My grades aren't what they should be because I don't study. My career is going nowhere because I have not developed my skills and I've not put in the effort. The prodigal son chooses to humbly accept responsibility for his actions, and it turns his whole situation around. It's a fairly simple formula, and it works exactly the same for us now as it did for him then. Just think about it. Weakness plus humility equals strength. Disappointment plus humility equals success. Failure plus humility equals victory. And on and on and on. Ultimately, it's the attitude of humility that allows us to take hold of any situation in our life and to turn it around for our advantage. The prodigal son decides to go back to the father and to admit his folly. He resolves, I will get up and go to the father. I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands. Notice that he doesn't make any excuses for his behavior. He doesn't say, Father, you should have known that it was a bad idea and you should have talked me out of it. What were you thinking? He doesn't say, as long as you treat me like a child, our relationship will always suffer. He doesn't say, Father, if you didn't love my brother more than you loved me, none of this would have happened. He doesn't say any of that. He says, Father, I sinned. Father, I sinned. He begins the long journey home, rehearsing what he's going to say. And here's what happened. While he was still far off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran and put his arms around him and kissed him. Then the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But that's when the father cuts him off. The guy didn't even get to finish his well-rehearsed speech because the father is so overcome and overwhelmed with joy at his return. This is another attribute of the surprising power of humility. Not only does it work, but it works quickly. Sometimes, instantly, the fastest way to bring peace to conflict is to simply admit, my fault. It's my fault. I'm wrong. I made the mistake. Not only does it work, but it works quickly. We've looked at the humility of the prodigal son, but we have to admit that he did act out of desperation, right? He only acknowledges his sin when he has no other choice. So he's not exactly a shining example for us. Eventually, he acts sensibly, but not impressively. And yet the interesting reprise to the story is that while the father knows all of that, he just doesn't care. Check this out. But the father said to his slaves, quickly bring out a robe, the best one, and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet, and get the fatted calf and kill it. And let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. The father is willing to take the son's contrition on any terms. And in that sense, it was actually the action of the father, not the son, that reveals the meaning of the story and the real heart of humility. Humility is really all about selfless love. This story is teaching us about the incredibly humble heart of God himself. We don't often think about it that way. But the heart of God is humble. We know that. We've been taught that because it's given its fullest expression on the cross. After Mass today, Nick, Sam, myself, and a few others will be available to pray with you and for you. God the Father wants to meet you here today. Are you like the prodigal son? Or are you like the other son? Wherever you're at, God wants to meet you there in prayer. And he wants to rejoice in you coming to him. So take this opportunity. Take it to be prayed for as an opportunity to return to the Father. Whether it's in a big way or in a small way. Come by yourself or come with your family. We're here for you. So now let me ask you a question. How are you doing with all of this? Are you cultivating a habit of admitting your faults and your failures? Or do you have a knee-jerk reaction to deflect responsibility? Do you own your own mistakes? Or are you just looking for others to blame? Is it just somebody else's fault all the time? Are you willing, honestly and regularly, are you willing to say, I'm sorry? Because when we do, it has this incredible ability to change and transform us more into the person that we want to be, the person that is more attractive to the people around us, and it's the person that God wants us to be. There's a kind of amazing irony at the heart of this whole series. As we aspire to be humbler, to lower ourselves and to let God be God, we actually become more like God. For a humble heart reflects the reality of God's own humble heart.